All right, I'm going to go ahead and knock this one out. This will be a little shorter. Lecture four, dealing with Martin Luther King, um, Bell Hooks, Peter Singer. Um, I call it "Love is what justice." I mean, justice is what love looks like in public. Um, some of the things you want to think about, obviously, again, is being affluent, um, famine, both physical and spiritual, and then just overall, we're still dealing with ethics and morality, right? So let me go ahead and see what I want to say here. So, all right, let's go ahead. Um, so this is what I want to say. Some people want morality to remain private. Be nice, be polite, right? Say please and say thank you. Don't hurt nobody, right? Hold the door for somebody, right? Those things matter, don't get me wrong. I'm not against kindness, right? But philosophy asks whether kindness is enough in a world where systems can crush people politely. Private kindness is not a substitute for public justice, right? Again, private kindness is not a substitute for public justice, right? So we think about f- the lecture before was about personal ethics, but now we're talking about public ethics, right? What do I owe to others? Not just what I owe to myself, but what do I owe to others, right? Maybe nothing, but hey, I wouldn't be Julius Bailey if I don't engage in a conversation. Justice can be defined as the moral and social ordering of life so that people receive uh, what they are due, human dignity is honored, and power is held accountable. Social ethics then would be the branch of ethics concerned with institutions, communities, structures, public responsibility, and collective life. Right? People like Martha King Jr. He represents love, law, and moral direction. Right? You all know Martin King, right? Um, 1929, I think his birthday was, and obviously he died in 1968, right? Um, Civil rights leader, Baptist minister, public intellectual, one of the central figures in the Black freedom struggle in the United States, right? Um, King had a PhD in theology. He was shaped by the Black church and the prophetic tradition, right? Um, Nonviolence of Mahatma Gandhi and the love of Jesus, right? So why am I bringing in King and philosophy? Well, King gives us a moral philosophy of justice, law, love, nonviolence, and even a democratic responsibility, right? We shouldn't reduce King to just a holiday, right? Or some dream we say he had, or a few say sentences, right? King was a thinker of power. He asked, when law is just, when civil disobedience is morally necessary, and how love can become public courage, right? He has a famous piece called The Letter from Birmingham Jail, where he's writing chiefly to white clergy who considered him unwise in some of his tactics, right? He had came to Birmingham by invitation by local activists, but more deeply, he says in his letter, he says that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, right? And that line, right? Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Now that's a theory, right? Of interdependence, right? of morality, right? Human lives are morally connected, socially connected, right? So that harm in one place affects harm in the entire community, right? That's a sort of a king like moral interdependence, right? Um, obviously, he did sit-ins and marches and other type of public pressure. A lot of folk ask, why can't you negotiate quietly, right? Peaceful protests, right? But King was like, well, you have to get involved in direct action, right? He bring so that it brings justice to the surface, so that negotiation becomes unavoidable, right? And so direct action then is what he engages in. It confronts injustice so that it forces a moral and political response, right? It engages in a constructive tension, right? Which creates the conditions for change, right? King sort of distinguishes between just and unjust laws. A just law sort of uplifts humans and human personality, and unjust laws degrades humanity, right? Segregation, for instance, was legal, but it wasn't moral, right? Does it uplift or does it degrade, right? Law and morality then are related, right? But they're not identical, right? That's where philosophers come here, right? The legal thing is not always a moral thing. Write that down. A legal thing is not always a moral thing, right? Yeah, like that, right? Sometimes people want peace. I just want peace, right? Which is the absence of tension, right? I don't want no tension. I want no problems, right? But peace, peace might need agitation, right? A city can be orderly and still be cruel. A campus can be silent and unjust, right? A family can avoid conflict and yet still be dishonorable amongst each other, right? Think of somebody like Bell Hooks, right? Bell Hooks, I mentioned your I'm going to have in your reading. Bell Hooks just died like in 2022, I think, right? Um, Bell Hooks was a black feminist. Um, she was born Gloria Jean. What was her last name? Forgot. Sorry. Um, she was a in her feminist thought. She was a teacher, philosopher. Worked on love and race and gender issues of education and class issues, right? And even some popular culture, right? Um, I'm bringing Hooks into this little mini lecture because she examines how domination affects everyday life, right? How love, education, and critical consciousness sort of helps repair human relations, right? Bell Hooks's work it belongs to feminist philosophy, social criticism, ethics, pedagogy, and cultural theory, right? So what do I mean by feminist philosophy, right? It's known as philosophical work that examines gender, power, oppression, embodiment, knowledge, and liberation, right? In one of her books, All About Love, she says we use the word a lot, right? But often refuse to define it, right? She don't want love to be just reduced to feelings, or love to reduce to romance, or love just to be reduced to just stuff, right? And so she's concerned about making sure that love is an active will that involves commitment, care, knowledge, responsibility, respect, trust, right? And so a love ethic then, King Hooks, a love ethic is a way of living that treats love as a disciplined practice of care, a disciplined practice of truth, and a disciplined practice amongst each other, right? What I mean by that, some people say they love you but don't care, right? They don't practice care. Students could say, "I love students." Teachers say, "I love students," but you don't listen to them. Politicians can say, "I love freedom," but you don't respect equality, right? Think about the Christian who says, "I love God," but you don't respect neighbors, right? Love shows up in not just habits, back to Aristotle, but also it represents itself in budgets, right? Love is a practice, not an emotion, right? So I was training under Cornell West. And so Cornell's one of his famous lines is, "Justice is what love looks like in public," right? Love is what justice is what love looks like in public. Love without justice becomes just mere or ornamentalism, right? Cold, domination, right? By a whole nother name, right? So if we think about these people, King and Hooks bring together like hair, right? I like Peter Singer too. Peter Singer is an Australian philosopher who does work in sort of animal ethics and applied philosophy, globalism, stuff like that, right? And he's also utilitarian, right? Singer. I've never had him for class, but he's taught at Princeton before. But he's one of the most, you know, influential and controversial living philosophers, right? He is a major figure in applied ethics, right? Peter Singer, right? Applied ethics takes philosophical tools and applies them to concrete moral issues, right? Poverty, right? Medicine, animal rights, technology, war, right? Punishment, right? Public policy, right? And so applied ethics, then again, is defined as the use of philosophical reasoning to examine real world ethical problems, right? That makes sense, right? So in his book Famine, Affluence and Philosophy, he says, imagine walking past a shallow pond and seeing a child drown. Most people would say we should jump in there and save the child. But then a singer says, if we can prevent suffering far away without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, why do we act like distance is too far to sort of engage in it, right? If it's effed up in Iran and it's effed up in Ukraine, we should speak on it, right? Right? But sometimes we become we become too comfortable, right? But if I can prevent severe suffering and the cost to me is small, am I more responsible to help? Am I required to help? That's Peter Singer, right? Singer is kind of abstract if we don't think about the way power activates. m- You know, not all help is wise, right? So sometimes charity, giving too much, can become paternalism, right? Um, it, 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 it might recapitulate certain unequal structures, right? If you keep giving to poor people and not train them to be not poor, all we're doing is recapitulating a particular thing, right? So Peter Singer wants us to think about moral and ethical solidarity, right? Standing together with people as shared responsibility, grounded in human dignity, right? Not pity. Pity looks down. Solidarity stands together with, right? Solidarity, it doesn't mean pretending that all suffering is the same. It don't mean speaking over people. It don't mean just saving people as if Julius is the hero of the story. It means recognizing that another person's wound has a claim on my consciousness. You like that? Like that. I'm gonna have to write that. King's Speech. Remember, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, right? Hook says love must be practiced. Singer says distance does not erase my moral responsibility. So all together, these three people ask whether we can become people whose moral concern travels beyond convenience. The moral life is not simply about avoiding personal wrongdoing. It's about becoming the kind of person who can hear the cry of another human being and not immediately protect yourself from the cries. A decent person may be kind to the people nearby, but a morally serious person asks, who has been kept outside of my circle of concern? And philosophy pushes the circle out a little bit more, right? It's not just here, it's here. Who is my neighbor when I can't even see their faces? You like that? So here's some questions I want you to answer in your lecture quiz. What is social ethics? Obviously, why does king matter in philosophy? Um, what does king mean by that term I gave you, constructive tension, right? Um, uh, I think I want you to think about bell hooks um, and in her concept of love is more than feeling. Peter Singer, what is applied ethics to him? What is moral distance according to Singer, right? And the concept of solidarity. All right, especially solidarity in conjunction or in relation to pity, right? So you got your reflective question in your Moodle, and maybe public justice should be required not just on campus, but maybe around your community. All right, thank you.